Tony Ferguson was once the scariest man in the UFC lightweight division, whose mere mention would strike fear in the hearts of his rivals. But then came the ill-fated night of UFC 249, and it all turned upside down. Some say the hero we all cherished lived long enough to see himself become the villain. The question is, how did things go south for Ferguson? Tony Ferguson entered the UFC guns blazing, knocking his opponent out cold with an earth-shattering blow to win the Ultimate Fighter welterweight tournament in 2011. His journey in TUF was an absolute rollercoaster ride, which continued its way up when he signed a contract with the UFC and moved down to his natural weight class, the lightweight 155-pound division, taking out the best it had to offer over the next few years. The American was a nightmare matchup for most fighters in his division, given his unorthodox style, unpredictability, and those razor blade-like elbows. Ferguson's high-octane fighting style was a menacing symphony of violence and ruthless aggression that would crush anyone who couldn't match his pace, and by anyone, I mean most of the guys in his division. He would walk forward with reckless abandon and take a bit of punishment to dish out 5 times more. Each of his fights was reminiscent of a horror movie, where the victims were left bloodied, bruised, and exhausted both mentally and physically. Ferguson was a true bogeyman in his heyday, who continued his reign of terror in the division for years, racking up 12 wins in a row by decimating the likes of Josh Thompson, Edson Barboza, Rafael dos Anjos, and Kevin Lee, whom the bogeyman beat to win the interim lightweight title in 2017. Ferguson's beatdowns of Barboza and Cerrone in particular were gruesome, since by the end of their respective bouts, they had their faces covered in blood and their eyes and mouths wide open like they'd been through hell and back. But while Ferguson was fighting fire with fire against some of the meanest guys on the planet and winning, he was also gradually losing himself in the process. He was growing old. His body was wearing and tearing apart, and injuries coupled with insane training methods took him out of the big leagues before he even realized it. In 2020, it finally came crashing down when Ferguson faced Justin Gaethje in another interim title fight after Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was originally scheduled to defend his belt against his longtime rival, failed to show up due to COVID. Gaethje beat Ferguson from pillar to post, countering with a sniper-like precision and rattling the former interim champ time and again. The striking differential between the two wasn't much. It was only 7 strikes in favor of Gaethje, but the accuracy is where the highlight won the fight. He landed 72% of his strikes, mostly targeting Ferguson's head, and he was out in the 5th round. There's just so much that a human body can take, and the hardcore ones know how hard Justin Gaethje hits, which means the fact that Ferguson absorbed all that punishment and still carried on to round 5 was a remarkable achievement in itself. But then again, each punch that Gaethje landed sped up Ferguson's aging in fighting terms. In just one night, Ferguson grew years older, and it was hard to see for those who loved the most entertaining wrecking ball of fury on the UFC roster. When you get beaten up so viciously after having dominated for years, it makes you question your skills and sanity. It creates doubts in your mind. It makes you overthink and complicate simple training methods and game plans. But most of all, it shatters your confidence and the ability to endure punishment, even if you are as mentally and physically tough as Tony Ferguson. There's so much that a human chin can take, and that's what happened in Ferguson's case. He lost his confidence. He started doubting himself and his teammates. He ended up breaking ties with people there with him through thick and thin. But what did it lead to? More defeats, more doubts, and more problems. After suffering a devastating defeat at the hands of Justin Gaethje, Ferguson lost 6 more times. His first 2 losses came against Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush, both of whom dominated and almost crippled him. One almost broke his arm, while the other was seconds away from blowing his knee out of the socket. However, Ferguson refused to give up because he was too tough for his own good. Against Michael Chandler, fight fans saw glimpses of old-school Ferguson at long last. But just when it looked like he was going to break the deadlock, he was knocked out cold with one of the most brutal front kick knockouts in mixed martial arts history. After his loss to Michael Chandler, Ferguson was choked out by Nate Diaz and Bobby Green, and he lost to Paddy Pimblett by a decision in his most recent fights. Now Diaz, Green, and Pimblett are three fighters Ferguson would have destroyed in his prime, by the way. It wouldn't have been a fair fight because Ferguson was simply a madman walking forward and blowing opponents apart with insane cardio and pressure, two key elements of his success for so long. Once he lost his key weapons, Ferguson lost his sheen. He wasn't the same anymore, but that's life in a nutshell. Where there is rise, there is fall. Where there is happiness, there is misery. It's the circle of life. From a 12-fight losing streak, Ferguson has dropped down to a 7-fight losing streak, and a win would put him on top of the list of fighters who have lost the most number of consecutive fights in UFC history. That's a terrible record to have for a person who had championship caliber and, in fact, remained the uncrowned king of his division for a very long time. From the most feared guy on the roster to a man who is now a tune-up for the rising UFC stars, Tony Ferguson's downfall has been devastating to watch for those who admire the Augies, fighters who put their hearts and souls on the line inside the cage for us violence-hungry couch potatoes. For years, Ferguson fought whoever the UFC put in front of him, and he continues to do so because he's a great company man. The only difference between then and now is that Ferguson doesn't have it in him anymore. He isn't as fast as he used to be. He isn't as vicious as he once was, and he isn't deadly enough on the mat anymore. He's only fighting because he loves the thrill of battle, but we hate to see the agony of his defeat time and again. What's worse is that he won't stop until he turns the tide in his favor. He thinks he's still skilled enough to win a UFC title, and perhaps he is. It's just that his body doesn't respond the way his brain wants it to, and that's where the problem lies. Because that means more physical and mental trauma, more defeats, and a mediocre fighting record that a fighter like Ferguson doesn't deserve. He deserves to be up there among the greatest lightweights of all time who failed to win the belt. He deserves a lot more than what he may end up with, and that's heartbreaking. Maybe even Ferguson knows that he is a shell of his former self, but his love for fighting has dictated his life for as long as he can remember, and he simply doesn't want to live a life where he has nothing to fight for. He's addicted to competing under bright lights. That's his drug. He doesn't want to wake up in the morning to read a newspaper or watch television for the rest of the day. He wants to punch someone in the face. He wants to twist a few limbs, and he wants to feel the excitement of fighting at the grandest stages of them all. But how much is too much? How much more brain trauma will make Tony Ferguson realize that he has a family to care for? The sooner he realizes that there is a world besides prize fighting, the better. Should Tony Ferguson retire? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you want to stay in the loop with the latest news in the MMA world, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next video.